Hello, my name is Charles Shearer. I'm a neuro-optometrist and serve as vision science consultant to Burtech Corporation. And today we're going to bring you another in the video series for clinical uses. This one is on the HMD device for the treatment of vision motion sensitivity. Vision motion sensitivity is also commonly referred to as visual vertigo, or even sometimes grocery store syndrome. Bronstein probably defined it best when he said it's a syndrome where symptoms are triggered or exacerbated in situations involving rich visual conflict or intense visual stimulation. It is also thought that these types of neurological insults create a discrepancy between what the person expects to see and what the external information is that they actually receive. This often results in an overdependence on vision to maintain balance. This is commonly seen in the grocery store. Patients will actually have to hang on to a cart to keep from falling down sometimes. Peripheral stimulation is just so intense it throws off their balance. Vision motion sensitivity can occur because of a mismatch between the central, sometimes referred to as the parvocellular system, and the peripheral or magnocellular system. The way these systems work visually is the peripheral vision is our motion detection system and processes visual information faster than the central vision system. The peripheral vision system tells us where to look and what to anticipate. The central vision gives us details about what is there. Here I've created a video that illustrates the best I can what this mismatch might look like. There can also be a mismatch between the vestibular system and the visual system. For example, the vestibular system may think that the head or body is leaning 5 degrees to the right when the visual system is telling it something quite different. And again, we've tried to create a video to illustrate this for you. And it could be leaning to the right, left, forward, or backwards, depending on what part of the vestibular system is compromised. But you can see how disorienting this would be. And unfortunately, some patients have a mismatch not only between the visual systems, but also between the visual and vestibular systems. So they get a little bit of everything, such as this. When this occurs, this is basically what it might look like. It's no wonder when patients notice these types of symptoms that they end up with dizziness, motion sensitivity, light sensitivity, headache, anxiety, and disorientation, causing balance issues and often fall. Here are a few of the conditions which cause those symptoms. How do we treat VMS? Well, there's two schools of thought, or two ways of doing it that have become quite popular. One is optokinetic stimulation with stationary anchoring, and this anchoring occurs in the periphery. And the other is desensitizing the optic flow that occurs. Here is an example of a peripheral anchoring and central movement. You can imagine a subway scene where much of it is stationary in the periphery, but the train is going by. And these optokinetic stripes could be going left to right to left, or up and down, or down to up. In the real world, though, more occurs with optic flow. Here's an example of a very slow optic flow scene. And the central stays pretty constant, pretty consistent until it moves into the periphery. Here's another example of optic flow. Notice that things tend to move from the central vision to the periphery. If we look at that upcoming birch tree in the center, it eventually would move to the side, and it also goes from being smaller to being larger. I use a lot of concentric kinetic flow before ever putting a patient into a head-mounted display because it's a less immersive environment. And here's what that would look like. And we do this with the BVT instrument. The object is not to start with the fastest speed and the highest contrast, which you're seeing here. And here we could even blur the edges by using a sine wave on those stripes. But if you notice, we've kept the speed the same, but I've reduced the contrast to 50%. And it appears to be moving less intense, less dramatic for the patient. We can adjust that to as low as 2%, or I typically start at 10%. If we put the contrast back up to full and slow down the speed, again, the effect or the symptoms are reduced. And as the patient improves, we would move the speed faster. If they're having trouble at this speed, then of course we can slow it down. These are the basic principles that we use with optic flow in the head-mounted display, except we're going to be using real scenes, and it is a much more immersive environment. They don't have any peripheral anchoring, so you have to be very careful, and you typically might start with them seated or pay attention to the risk of fall. And here I've done both. I've reduced the speed to 1/4 of what it was and reduced the contrast to half. And believe me, for some patients, that's still not mild enough. We have to even go slower. And then again, here we're back up at the full speed and full contrast to show you what we're talking about. Perhaps an easier way of viewing this is I've created two videos here, exactly the same scene, moving at two different speeds. And imagine that this effect is much more intense when it's in a head-mounted display because of the immersive environment. The content makes a big difference too. The more detail there is, the more processing that needs to be done, the more confused the patient can be. So here are two identical speeds with just different context. So how do we use the HMD to treat VMS? Well, here are your options within the HMD menu right now. You can do optic flow scenes, but they're just going to go right to left and left to right. If you look down towards the bottom, you'll see we have 3 visual flows: a boardwalk, a driving simulator, and a park. And what we'll do is change all of these variables that we've been talking about to help the patient adjust and adapt to this. And this is the screen in the software where you can pick all of these variables. We can change the speed, the length, how many obstacles we put in there, how much detail there is in the center, how much is in the periphery, how much distraction, and we can even add cognitive tasks. This video demonstrates several of those variables, especially highlighting changing the speed in this video. The object is the patient is on a balance board or force plate, and they have to keep that blue dot as well as they can within that circle. And as we're moving along, the speed can change, the distractions can change, and we can even add a cognitive task, either Stroop type tasks or a mathematical problem. And here again, we're changing speed. And again, this can be much more disturbing and disorienting to the patient because these stripes on the boardwalk there are disorienting. Next, we'll illustrate the driving simulation. Again, we can change many of these same variables with speed. This time we can even change lighting, and we'll add a cognitive task to this illustration. The windshield wipers serve as a distraction. The uprights on the windshield give you some peripheral anchoring. And here we're at medium speed, but we're going to add a cognitive demand. The overhead signage coming up will display a word, and of course you're supposed to say what the word is, not its color. We can also view this from outside the car. Here we don't have that same peripheral lock, so this is illustrating the two techniques within one option here, adding a cognitive demand. And finally, let's go for a walk in the park. What I'd like you to notice in this video clip, among other things, is the central density. We can either use dirt, rocks, or brick. With the brick pattern, it's very disturbing, particularly if the patient were to tip their head down and see these stripes going by. It gives you almost an optokinetic type of effect. But here we're going slow on a very plain walking surface. There's a lot in the periphery. We're asked to keep that blue target within the black circle. We're trying not to hit the bench. And again, we're controlling all of the position with the force plate. And here, this pattern is less homogeneous, but it doesn't have the stripes and the distortions that you're going to see here in a second. We have a lot of patients that will have difficulty with this. I had a patient that could not walk up bleachers, could not walk down a pier because these horizontal stripes disoriented them. And with the head-mounted display, if I were to tip my head down, these stripes become much more intense as I'm looking at the ground. They seem to be going by faster and have much more effect. So again, like most of our therapies, this is a crawl, walk, run situation. We start with the simplest tasks, see how much they can handle, and very gradually increase the variables. Which variables to increase first is very patient dependent. You basically find the ones that are disturbing them the most, and that's where you start, and that's where you slowly work for improvement. If you don't have access to this kind of technology, there are some low-tech things that you can do. I often have my patients limit their times when they go to the grocery store to off-peak so there's less confusion. An interesting technique that I learned from a patient was a hoodie. You just basically pull that hoodie forward and it acts as blinders like would be on a horse, where you limit the amount of peripheral exposure, which in turn limits the symptoms. Eye doctors often will use binasal or bitemporal occlusion to disrupt the effects between the two eyes. You can walk at quiet times on those even non-patterned surfaces. Limit the amount or degree of action that's going on in TVs and movies. I mean, it's very difficult for many of our patients to be watching Fast and the Furious, where there's just so much going on, so much movement. Even in the central vision can be very disturbing. And be aware of lightings. Sodium vapor lights from the big box stores in different lighting situations can cause a lot of disturbance to patients. And also, when they're in the grocery store or similar situations, make sure that they have either support from a caregiver, use a walker or cane, or hang on to the grocery cart. I'd like to thank you for your time and attention, and please keep an eye out, pun intended, for more clinical videos. Thank you and be safe.